Okay, I'm over here. So this is the, what are we calling this, Hans?
History and the Power of Narrative.
History and the Power of Narrative. So I think this was this your idea of doing these talks? We wanted to mix things up a little bit because in previous years it's just been panel after panel after panel. So we want to do some things a little differently. So Hans had this idea of doing some short talks by different people, and then with a period of questioning after that, after each of them, rather than doing a full panel. And I think that was a good idea. And we originally had 4 of these scheduled, which is why it says 4 in the program, and there's only 3 listed because the Newquists could not make it because Russell had to have shoulder surgery. So that's why we're down a significant percentage of people this year because. But Morgan was going to be doing a cool presentation that unfortunately we don't get to see. Maybe next year she'll do it, and hopefully they'll all be back. So that's why we have 3 presentations instead of 4. I think I have a full 2 hours booked for this. Is that right?
No, 1 hour.
Oh, it's only 1. Okay, so we
do we have 2?
No.
Okay, I gotta let you get started then.
And all the superhero fans will be upset if you run over Rachel.
I will.
They'll have to fight you.
I will. Yeah, I guess I shrank it to 1 hour. I think I still had 2 hours. So I can't take up any more time. Hans, up to you. Down to you. Up to you.
Rachel leads us off.
I thought I was going to use this one.
Oh.
You didn't tell them who I am. All right, they know. Okay.
You gotta introduce.
What?
You gotta introduce Rachel. You gotta tell me. Okay. Most people know, but
Our first speaker. Our first speaker here is Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, Professor of Medieval History at the University of Chicago. She has been a BasedCon feature since the very beginning. This is her 5th BasedCon, 5th appearance. And she is going to tell us about the Geatish dragons of Denmark.
I'm returning to my theme of the first conference, Tolkien. Tolkien, as we all know, was no fan of allegory. As he famously declared in the foreword to the 1965 paperback edition of The Lord of the Rings, I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. How interesting, therefore, that in his now equally famous 1936 British Academy lecture on Beowulf, he castigated his fellow scholars for reading the poem as a source of history, rather than, as he insisted they should, taking it on its own terms as a work of art. In his words, quote, Beowulf is not an actual picture of historic Denmark or Geatland or Sweden about AD 500, but it is, if with certain minor defects, on a general view, a self-consistent picture, a construction bearing clearly the marks of design and thought. And indeed, we might say, Tolkien won this round, or did he? Thanks to Tolkien's scolding, not to mention his use of the dragon for his own artistic purposes, Beowulf has been held up for the past 80 years plus as a great work of art, more famous for its fairy tale monsters than its historical setting. Certainly it contains lots of names and place names that suggest its author must have known something about Denmark, or Geatland or Sweden, but nobody now thinks that it tells us anything accurate about their actual history. It is surely better to concentrate on the monsters, as Tolkien suggested, than to spend our time knocking over towers looking for clues. Except, most of the poem is not about our hero Beowulf's fight with the monsters. Most of it, in gaming terms, is backstory. Genealogies of the Shieldings, accounts of kinslayings and feuds, betrayals and doomed marriage alliances, recaps of the wars between the Geats and the Swedes, and prophecies of doom. You can see why the historians got excited and started knocking over the poem tower. No, 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 we can hear Tolkien exclaim, don't look over there. We've got a dragon to slay. In his words, quote, the monsters are essential, fundamentally allied to the underlying ideas of the poem. which give it its lofty tone and high seriousness. Well and good, but why then all the backstory? To give Tolkien credit. There are reasons to be suspicious of Beowulf as an actual picture of historic Denmark or Geatland or Sweden about AD 500. For one, the date of the manuscript. That's right, there is only one manuscript, and it has been conclusively dated on paleographical grounds, the handwriting of the two scribes, to a single decade, sometime between AD 1001 and AD 1010. In other words, 500 years after the events purportedly described in the poem. Oh, but wait, you will say, how do we know when to date the events? Because we know when Beowulf's uncle Hygelac died at the hands of the Franks, aka the Merovingians, thanks to a reference in Gregory of Tours. Hygelac mounted a piratical raid on the Frisian coast, and Prince Theudebert, son of King Theuderic, reigned AD 511 to 534, intercepted and killed him along with most of his men. Beowulf swam away with 30 suits of armor, but Theudebert took Hygelac's breastplate and jeweled neckring. Fantastic? Perhaps, but it gives us a date around AD 525. These two dates leave a considerable gap in our knowledge about when and by whom Beowulf was written, fueling a whole sub-industry of Beowulf studies arguing dates. But there is a further complication. You may have heard of the Danes. The Danes, to put it mildly, were not the friends of the Anglo-Saxons, spending centuries from AD 793 to 1014 sending their own raiding parties to the English coast. The poem, however, is written in Old English. That is, for those keeping track, the language of the people the Danes conquered, and famously, in the case of Canute, married. Although technically Ethelred's widow Emma was from Normandy, even for son Edward to become the last king of pre-Norman England, don't get me started. Here's the question. How could a poem written in Old English preserve the history of the people whom the English, the Anglo-Saxon, audience of the poem would have considered their mortal enemies? And not just preserve their history, but send the hero of the poem, the Geat Beowulf, to their rescue. Spoiler alert, even Tolkien changed his mind, although it is only since AD 2014 when Christopher published his father's prose translation of the poem and some of his lecture notes that this has started to become clear. Even if the Beowulf poet wasn't writing history, he had an uncanny sense of when to insert his fairy tale elements into the political chronology, just before everything fell apart for the Geats and the Danes. It would take longer than we have this morning to unpack the details, not to mention requiring more philological chops than I can comfortably command. But to give you a taste, let's talk about Meo the Setla, in the vulgar tongue, mead benches. More to the point, what it meant to open the poem with a shout out to Shield Sheafing, great breaker of mead benches, who struck fear into his enemies. Excuse me, would you like to share this?
Sorry. I'm trying to help you because we have less time than I thought, so we're going to give you and Blaine this full hour, so you have half.
Oh, goody. I'll slow down.
And then, so you're not quite as pressured, and then Hamza's going to do his thing at 3 o'clock.
Okay.
Instead, because we have a free hour then. So
settle in. I was trying to do this to time and everything, right? Okay, so mead benches, look. 3 different translations of the opening lines, right? And the whet, there's a whole debate. Listen, low, well, right? How do you translate it? Getting the sense of this opening scene is incredibly important because of that word arrow, which is a singular word, A-E-R-O-L, right where that line, that tag is pointing you. And Tom Shippey, on whom I'm relying completely in all of this, so this is basically a book review for you of Tom Shippey's excellent book, says that you can see how many different translations there are. Lutze translates it plural, struck fear into earls. Tolkien said he who laid fear upon men, he who was first found forlorn, which means nothing and is sort of like, okay, it's singular, but why should we make it a plural? But what should we do with that? Shippey says, and I think this is Shippey relying on other people too, it's singular, fear into the warrior, but it's actually a people name, not a person name. According to Tom Shippey, this Earl, okay, you have to worry about the Earl and also the we, right? We have heard of him. Well, why should he be so famous? Why should defeating Earl be as bad as breaking up the mead benches? Well, according to Tom Shippey, most likely Earl was not a single warrior, but a whole people. In fact, the feared Eruli, the quote, barbarians, famous for their height, for fighting without helmets or armor, and for their kindly habit of killing any of their male relatives who survived to old age, to spare them the terrible shame of dying a natural death. They were, in a word, badass, and shield chiefing was badassier, which means breaking the mead benches was probably something more than simply throwing furniture about. Something, let's say, a monster would do. This is a mead hall. Okay, it's a modern reconstruction of what we think a mead hall looked like, but it gives you the flavor. Here's where it originally stood, conveniently right where the Beowulf poet locates Hrothgar's mead hall of Herod. What, if you were Hrothgar, would you do with a mead hall like this? Hold court, assemble together all of your men and seat them on mead benches where they would drink mead. Hand out gifts, aka mathams, to those who had served you well in between bouts of drinking. Lots and lots of mathams. More mathams if you were particularly good at collecting them. The fancier, the better. But here's the thing. Where would you get such mathams? This is actually a serious question because there's no gold in the north.
You take it from somebody else.
Stealing them! Exactly. By stealing them off of other men, right? Remember that neck ring that Prince Thudebert took from Beowulf's uncle Hygelac right after he killed him? Right, the same neck ring, according to the Beowulf poet, that Hrothgar's queen Wealhtheow gave to Beowulf after she warned Hrothgar about adopting Beowulf as his son when Beowulf was there, seated on the bench between her sons, Hrethric and Hrothmund. The neck ring, in other words, was intended for Beowulf, not Hygelac. Ominous stuff. To paraphrase Shippey, these were pirate societies based on looting each other for treasure and handing out gifts as markers of worth. It gets worse. Remember that mead hall? There's a backstory about it, first recorded about the time that Canute became king of the English. Tolkien alluded to it in his commentary on the names associated with Hrothgar's mead hall Herod, albeit with his customary dividends. Quote, the site of Herod had a religious significance, Tolkien notes, with a footnote on the names Froda and Engel as references to the Norse gods Njordr and Frey, Ingvi Frey, quote, this is Tolkien again. But also after the Danish seizure of this site, we find the name Freyawaru given to Hrothgar's daughter, and the Danes claim the title Friends of Ing, end quote. That sounds friendly. Even if Freyawaru does mean, as Shippey points out, pledge of Frey. But wait, there's more. When Hrothgar and his Danes get frustrated at not being able to get rid of Grendel, they turn to pagan sacrifices, offering, quote, honor to idols at pagan temples, as one recent translation puts it. Tolkien is more specific. At times, quote, at times they vowed sacrifices to idols in their heathen tabernacles. At Gret, I don't have the chops, as I said, to say these names. Gret Hertrafu. The key word here is Hertrafu, which you see at the end there, a compound of her, meaning fane or altar, surviving now only in old place names such as Harrow on the hill. So it's like Harrow, it's the holy place. With treif, meaning tent, on which Lexine Tolkien comments laconically, It's astonishing how he's not telling you what he's actually saying here. Quote, "It is therefore all the more remarkable that the place of the seat of the Skjoldungar, the Shieldings, in Old Norse should be Lera, as the name is in modern Danish." Danish is given there. For this name seems to be an ancient name for a tent or tabernacle. At least it could be most easily be related to Gothic Baithra, tent. What happened at Lera that Tolkien should be so coy? To be sure, the Beowulf poet says no more than the Danes, quote, "in prayers implored the slayer of souls to afford them help against the sufferings of the people." But more recent archaeological investigation has given weight to another, likewise famous account of the sacrifices made by the Danes in this tabernacle. I can do a whole footnote on why tabernacle is a wild term to be using here, but we can save that for the comments. J.R.R., writing in AD 1016, the Bishop of Merseburg noted, "In those parts, the center of the kingdom is a place called Lera, in the region of Salem. Every 9 years, in the month of January, after the day of which we celebrate the appearance of the Lord, they all convened here and offered their gods a burnt offering of 99 human beings, and as many horses along with dogs and cocks, the latter being used in place of hawks. As I have said, they were convinced that these would do service for them with those who dwell beneath the earth and ensure their forgiveness for any misdeeds." Well then, okay. I should say at this point that I have spent decades, quite embarrassing, decades following Tolkien's insistence that there was nothing to see here, just us monsters, when teaching Beowulf in my section of History of European Civilization, as well as in courses on Anglo-Saxon England and writing historical fiction. Having read Tom Shippey's little revisionary booklet this May, I am now scrambling to revise my lecture notes in preparation for classes this autumn. You may be wondering, whose story is this anyway? Well, according to Professor Shippey, it's complicated until you pay attention to all of the names, not just the ones in the monster episodes. There are 9, Shippey counted them, and he's actually, in his book, he's actually referring to previous scholarship of his own. There's a whole paper on the names of Beowulf and so forth. So this is highly technical. I'm just giving you the surface vision of it. There are 9 names, proper names, in the monster third of the poem, apart from Beowulf, the name. But there are more than 60 names in the framing sections, the stones that Tolkien's contemporaries have been so eager to pull out from the tower of the poem. Why include so much allegedly irrelevant detail in a poem about fighting monsters unless they already meant something to the audience? And Shippey is here also relying on Sam Newton's research. So this is a project of a number of iterations. And they're also relying a lot on the archaeology. So. Shippey dismisses the suggestion that the names were included simply as useless details to create an air of reality and truth, as one might do in a modern novel. In Shippey's words, quote, "The poet spent so much time and effort on the background of his fairy tale of troll, hag, and dragon, putting in all the names and allusions because he thought, rightly or wrongly, that it was all true, historical fact. He expected," Tolkien, Shippey talking about Tolkien, right? Shippey talking about the Beowulf poet, He expected his original audience to recognize the names and understand the allusions, and check or challenge him if they disagreed with him, because they also thought it was true, part of their own history and heritage. But to coin a phrase, who was this we? So we have heard the stories that I'm about to tell you, with all of these names in it, that, I mean, it's like following Tolkien's on the cheese, right? And recognizing, as Shippey has done all of the deep research on exactly what those names are and where they're coming from. Who would know them, right? One of the other things Shippey does very nicely in this demonstration is saying, some of these, you could say they're in there for, flavor and color, but the thing is that some of the names that are explained least are the ones that we know something about, and vice versa. It doesn't match up with any, they're all fictional, right? right? That there's some way in which his audience would know this. Well, I will leave you the pleasure of reading Professor Shippey's proof in full and skip to his conclusion. This blew my mind when I realized what he was arguing. We were the Geats, who fled the destruction of their mead halls soon after the death of Beowulf, coming to northern England and settling, according to Shippey, a North Yorkshire man. Because all of these arguments depend on like where I came from or my family did. But Shippey makes an excellent argument saying they came to northern England and settled in the northeast of England near Durham and Gillingshire, he calls it in Geatland. They are the ones who remember the names of the Geatish royal family, like Hrethel, Heribald, Hretkin, Hygelac, Hedred, Ingeld, and Beowulf. The followers of Getla, or rather asterisk Geatilla, or asterisk Goutilla, Daddy Geat, if you remember your diminutives like Attila, aka Daddy the Hun. Yes, really. They also remembered the mead halls that were no longer there. What happened to them? Remember Shield and his habit of furniture breaking? How he, quote, took away the mead benches from troops of enemies and struck fear into the warriors' warriors? The 5th and 6th centuries, aka the migration period, was not an easy time up north. There were feuds and crop failures and years when the sun didn't shine over the whole of the earth. Probably because of a volcano, except nobody knew where or how many volcanoes were involved. And we know this now because of core sample studies and ice studies and such, that the volcanic eruptions they're recorded by people like Procopius, but mainly as there was no sun that year. It's from the dust. Causing global cooling and famine and plague and more feuds, and even worse, the mead halls burned down. More than once. Because that is what folk kings, Theodekinga, did, aka pirate lords that are gang leaders, when they captured the mead halls of their enemies, after slaying the men on the benches. Just as it says in the poem, Grendel did. And I do invite you to reread the poem, realizing that this is a description of what happened in the mead hall as the men are being murdered. Because he was jealous of the merrymaking and storytelling going on in the hall. More than once, the women must have woken up after a night of mead drinking to find all the men dead. Ladies, watch these guys. More than once, the women and children must have fled lest they be captured and sold to other warriors as slaves. More than once, the ladies of the mead halls must have looked over at their sons sitting on the benches with the warriors and wondered when they would be taking the atoms from their bodies and running away. So Tolkien was wrong about the history, but right about the monsters. The monsters were real. That is, real memories of the trauma of the mead halls, of the kinslaying and the hoarding and the thieving and the fires that burned the mead halls down. The only real riddle is why has it taken for us so long to see it when it was right there all along staring us in the face. I kept my 20 minutes, and now I have questions.
I think we can take a question or two for Professor Rachel Fulton Brown. Let me walk the mic over to you.
Ma'am, the horse sacrifices, is this related to Aryans and the migrations that I guess some of us who have been following some of the recent genealogical stuff has been talking about?
So all of this, the deep research, if you want all of the archaeology, comes out of the things that people are finding in these, this is what we have, right? Outlines. And the archaeology, like that is apparently one of the most famous objects that's been found in these digs, that it looks like it's a piece of a helmet, right, with the eye. They're finding things like the mead halls were actually burned down, and there was one that Shippey talks about that they find the bones left in it to be chewed by dogs. So it's definitely what's happening in the poem of the people being murdered in the halls and the halls being burned down. The arguments about exactly what's happening at Lyra, which is this site, and the sacrifices, I mean, we've been going back and forth on whether or not Tietmar knew what he was talking about. And the more the archaeology is looking at these places, the more we're thinking maybe he did know what he was talking about. But I'm not as far into that scholarship, because I just read Shippey in May and realized that I had been telling my students the wrong thing for decades. No, seriously, this is horrible, right? Following Tolkien, who insisted, no, it's a poem, don't worry about the history of it, and then realizing that, in fact, it may be the most accurate description we have of what happened in those meat halls that we have, because it's like when you read Grendel going and eating all the bodies, they were chewed by dogs.
I'm going to ask Blaine to go ahead and get your presentation ready while we do one last question for Professor Rachel Fulton Brown.
He's got one here.
Oh.
How much of the story, the poem, and everything has become a national myth or presence for this country of Denmark? In the sense that, yes, they're finding new things, but how much of it has become so embedded that every new thing found they're going to challenge?
So that's been their problem, right? And that's what Tolkien was worried about. When the poem was first published in 1815, I mean, one, it was jumped on as English, right? And so, and this is the problem, is like, if you realize it's written in Old English, how does the poet know anything happening in this other region? And until they started doing all of the prosopography at the level we can do now with all the databases, it was hard to prove that any of these characters were real, or that they were mentioned. So this is all actually it's like in the last maybe 20 years, 10, 20 years. And I'd say with Shippey's little book now finally getting out to those of us who are not specialists in the field, Beowulf has been a story that went with English nationalism for a very long time. And I think what this is now doing is showing, I think with this migration period story, what I realized with this is, one of the huge challenges for English history is we have no clue what the paganism was of the people before they convert to Christianity, and they convert right after this. Gregory the Great sends the mission in 590, and they show up, and Bede, who's always our first place after Gildas, etc., seems to know nothing about what their gods were, what their traditions were, what their sacrifices were, and so we've just said, we don't know. But now, if you realize, one, what they were was refugees, right? The people that came across and survived all of that feuding and kin killing and everything, they came with nothing, right? The Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons, but they also probably drove out, the archaeology is also showing this, they probably drove out all the people that were living there already. So it's a trauma, there's a lot of trauma story in the background of this, and the degree to which we are able to accept that as part of the story is an interesting element of it. There's one man who's doing a lot of migration studies that's very interesting, and he's with the archaeology saying it's comical to pretend that this wasn't a really brutal transition.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Let's have a round of applause. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our